Wednesday this year. Who from the public would like to speak this evening? Okay. Joe, you want to go first? You are welcome. If you could state your name and address. They working? The question was whether you have to let's see if it's on.
Oh, there it goes.
Okay. I'm Joe Bors, 10 Beechwood Drive, Sandy Hook. And as a private citizen, but I thought I'd come tonight and make just a few comments relative to the fact that I was on the Charter Revision Commission in 1986 and again in 1990. And you people are running up against the same questions that we had back then. And finally what came out in the 87 issue of the Charter Revision, okay, thank you, of the Charter Revision was that you had 3 questions. Shall a sum of X number of dollars be appropriated for the annual town budget for the 19 fiscal year? And then the second question applied to the same thing relative to the Board of Education. And there was one advisory question only. And if the budget is defeated, you wish to see the amount appropriated for general purposes other than education increased or decreased. It doesn't say anything about Board of Education. So I think you people got a problem, because back then the atmosphere was that people were not crazy about bifurcating the budget because they felt that it would be polarizing the town. Well, I think in today's world, not only nationally but locally, we are pretty well polarized. So I think it's time that we act as a town together, forget the politics, and get this job squared away, and get it squared away once and for all, so that we have an honest budget debate, and we get hopefully an approved budget the first time around. It costs this town $8,000 to $10,000 every time we have to have a referendum, and we don't need that, especially in today's economy. I only have a couple of suggestions. One is, if you want to look at I spent a fair amount of time in the town clerk's office today, and if you go into the vault and go right back to the wall and slightly to your right, you'll see an open shelf that has copies of the regular printed copies of the charter, but there are also some folders in there that have a lot of information from the previous charters that were done, the paperwork from the committee. So that would be available to you. My only other suggestion would be is that you get in touch with CCM and suggest or ask them to give you a list of all the towns that currently have bifurcated budgets and or questions on the ballot, and get that stuff in and get it. You have to get it fast. The guy that I talked to down in CCM on another matter, the state at CCM is split in half, and the western half is Tony, I can't think of his last name, he's an Italian guy, very, very pleasant. The other is controlled by a young lady, I guess, and she takes care of the eastern part of the state. So if you just call CCM, ask for research department, and ask for Tony, you'll get the towns that are involved in our ERG or whatever you call it. But I just wanted to let you know, well, I'm sure you already know, the last thing I wanted to point out or give to you, in fact, I'm going to give you all of this, was that on September 15, 2010, a hearing was called, and to discuss the budget, to include separate budget questions, and to consider non-binding questions, and to consider a budget ballot requiring each voter to approve the budget or reject the budget because it's too high, or reject the budget because it's too low. One choice only. Advisory questions are not necessary. Now, during that time, Jan Andrews was on that committee, and I have a copy of a memo that she wrote to Bill Lavery, who was the chairman of the Charter Revision, and she suggested that we look at the item number 3 called out in this announcement for the meeting. And Ben Sprague, I have a copy of a memo that was written on 10/4/2010 by Ben Sprague, and he was very much opposed at that time to a bifurcated budget. And also on the ballot question, he would not support advisory questions. So I'm going to give all this information to you people.
Hey, Joe, if you could give it to Arlene when you're done, that would be great, our clerk, because what she'll do is she'll distribute to all of us. I do have a question for you. Do you remember, Joe, we used to have advisory questions here in Newtown. We used to have advisory questions in Newtown from mid-'80s to the early '90s. Yeah, do you have...
1 year, and then it came back again. Came in, went out, came in, went out. So it's all, that information just will have to be... The vault, as I said, in the town clerk's office, and go back to that area there, there's a lot of information there that would probably answer your question.
Joe, thanks a lot for your recommendations. Just so you know, we have done searches with CCM, and we have done cuts of towns that are like Newtown from a DRG standpoint, and those who have bifurcated budgets. So 3 came up in a similar group as ours, and that's Simsbury, Madison, and Fairfield. We're also looking at it from the advisory standpoint, but that's going to take a little bit longer. So I appreciate it. We are working on that from that angle.
I'm very sympathetic to the job that you've got to do. It's not going to be easy when you've got a real tight schedule. You've got to get it done for November ballot. I don't know when you... It is that you have to have it on...
The 20th of August for the Legislative Council. Are there any questions for Joe from the panel? Go ahead, Ron.
Shut off your, somebody. There we go. My question, Joe, is this. You mentioned the similar towns. I think you're referring to the DRG designation. We're a B. Why does it make any difference if we look at similar towns where what we're talking about is a process that could take place in any of these DRGs? Does it make any difference?
No, I just mentioned DRG for whatever reason, I don't know, but I think that you should be looking at every town, regardless of whether they're the same size as Newtown or similar to. I think you should look at every town that's in the western part because that's what Tony takes care of. Tell them you want to know every town in that area, geographic area, which is about half the state, that has bifurcated budgents.
We want to get a budget that works. I mean,
yes.
A system, a process that works.
Well, the reason I'm saying that is because I'm just wrapping up in a research project that I'm working on, and it's very difficult at times to get anybody in these town governments to tell you anything. And very little of it, oh, it's been that way since I came here. And, you know, it goes on and on. So, you know, if you want to get it done and get it done right the first time, I think you really got to get after these towns and see what you can get out of them. I spent a lot of hours on the phone, and I even visited a couple of the first selectmen of the towns that I was interested in and had discussions with them, and some of it was helpful and some of it wasn't. Well, good luck, and hope we have success this time.
For the public. John? Or, you can come now.
John Voris, 29 Main Street. My only requests are that whatever is decided to be placed on the ballot does not create more confusion than clarity, and that the outcome does not pit education against government. I've lived here far too long to already know both sides of the equation need healthy assistance. Thank you.
Anyone else from the public? Going once? Twice? Okay, that concludes the public hearing. What I'd like to do is now call the regular meeting of the Charter Revision Commission to order. And if Michelle, if you could, lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The flag is alive. Eileen, could you do roll call? He will not be here. Here. I'm here. 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 All right. I was wondering if I could get a motion for approving the minutes of the last meeting. And if there are any changes, please state that. Second. I think discussion standpoint, my name has to be Godin, right, Arlene? And I think we had Paul Lundquist as a member of the public. He's also chairman of the Charter Revision Commission, nominating committee. Right? We got you. After that, all those in favor? Aye. It carries. So now the fun stuff begins. We had a number of people that we called for this meeting that represent the town in various different boards. And what we wanted to get was your opinions and answer some questions regarding what worked, maybe what could have been better. And talk a little bit about the charge that we got and see how, if we made changes based on the charge, how you think it would help you in the budget process. So, Mary Ann, do you want to go first?
Mary Ann Jacobs, 65 Mohawk Trail in Sandy Hook. I'm here tonight as a member of the council. Jeff Capici asked me to attend in his place. I'm the vice chair. I was a member of the Charter Revision Appointment Committee, and I did vote in favor of seating this commission a few weeks ago. I just want to remind everybody, though, that my comments really are my own and don't represent the views of anyone else on the council. I'm very much in favor of the work that this committee is beginning to do, and I look forward to hearing the results of your investigation. While I see bifurcation and advisory questions as a potential solution that might help prevent some of the confusion of this past budget season, I have some serious concerns that I'd like to share with you in the hopes that you'll consider them during your deliberations, and I would look forward to hearing some of the answers to your research when you come back to the council with your recommendation. First, the conclusions reached by the last Charter Revision Commission indicated that the only way to bifurcate the budget was by making the referendum non-binding until both sides of the budget had passed. My concerns are several in this area. First of all, what happens when one side passes and then the other side gets adjusted and the whole thing goes back to the voters and that side that passed doesn't pass the second time? No. I want you guys, and you don't have the answers, I'm sure. I want you to, I do want the answers when you come back after you've done your deliberation. I have some serious concerns about saying to a voter, go vote, and then saying to him later, oh, that vote didn't count, it's a do-over if the vote passed. What if it passes and the council changes it in order to find an acceptable solution to getting the other side passed? Again, how can we discard the voters' decisions? On the other side of the coin, where does the money come from to increase one side of the budget if the other side of the budget does not go back to the council for adjustment in the event it is passed? I think these are difficult questions, and I'd like to see you guys think about those while you're deliberating. Next, I want to clearly understand how the debt service will be handled. Today, as most of you know, the debt service sits on the selectmen's side of the budget. So if a voter thinks we borrow too much, for example, whether it's borrowing for the school side or for the education side, the way for them to express that displeasure is to vote no on the selectmen's side of the budget and say it's too high, when that might not actually address their concerns, because your only recourse at that point is to actually lower the operating side of the budget. You can't impact debt at all. So how do you handle that? Is there a way to take debt service and bifurcate that as well? I don't know the answer, but I hope you're going to consider those concerns as well. I'm concerned about how bifurcation will affect collaboration between the business units. Today we see a very regular exchange of services and labor, especially between departments like Park and Rec, Public Works, and the school's maintenance department. A year or two ago, probably more like 2 or 3 years ago, the council commissioned an ad hoc committee to look at a lot of these issues and came back and said, you know what, we do a pretty good job of collaborating across business units. And the results of that, one of the results of that ad hoc committee was to put together this commission that looked at combining some of the municipal operations services with schools operations services. The council and the Board of Ed recently got a presentation, I think the Board of Finance as well, that talked about different ways we can start consolidating those kind of services here in this building. What happens to those kinds of efforts if we're going to bifurcate the budget? I mean, does that, are people still going to be willing to do that? There's other bigger picture questions surrounding issues of successes of this kind of effort in other towns. When the reading that I've done shows that many of the towns who've bifurcated have really just done it in the last few years. And when the first Charter Revision Commission came to us with the results, some of those towns had newly done it. So now we have an effort to look, an opportunity to look back at some of those towns with another year or two under their belt and see, did it really make a difference? Is it helpful? Does it mean that there's less times going back to the polls? Is it helpful or hurtful to one side of the budget or the other? I'm interested in what's really happening in those other towns to determine, is it really going to make a difference here or not? Does it increase the number of voters who come out to vote? Does it lower the controversy? I mean, there's been a lot of talk about splitting the town and causing divide. I don't think we could be a lot more divided than we are right now, but I think those are important questions that we need to answer. I've always heard that, superficially, that education gets hurt by bifurcation. I know the last time we looked at this, the then chair of the Board of Education spoke out against bifurcation, and I think that was one of his concerns. I would want to be sure that neither side of the budget is adversely affected on a regular basis. So, I'd hope that when we look at what's happening in other towns, there's some conclusions we can draw that help us understand that if there's any kind of consistency in what happens. So, I look forward to your recommendation. I think you have a lot of good information that's already been done by some of by the last Charter Revision Commission, and it gives you a good basis to kind of move forward and add to that. And I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Are there any questions from anyone in the commission? Anthony?
we pass a budget now with one figure, but obviously internally there's accounting between Board of Ed and town, and during the course of the year, how hard a line is that in between? Do you guys, is it rock solid? Okay.
Craig?
If that line is rock solid, and now you're talking about sharing of services.
Move me the mic, Craig.
Talking about sharing of services. How are the allocations handled then when you cross that line with your services?
Well, and, you know, John Courts may be able to answer some of these specific financial questions a little better than me, but today the kind of collaboration that's being done is very informal. Can I use your loader? Sure. Can I use your pickup truck? And they are just doing it in a spirit of cooperation, and it's more of a internal, they work together kind of thing. So there's nothing formal going on in that respect. In the kind of project we're talking about embarking on, which is much more specific, where, for example, the payroll services for the town and the Board of Education will be combined, I would assume they'll figure out, you know, there's X many employees on one side and X on the other, and it'll be 60-40 or 30-80 or 20-80 or whatever the split is, but that hasn't been addressed yet.
Okay, so from what you kind of pointed out as your concerns, this informal sharing of resources could be at risk.
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, if the, let's say the municipal side of the budget got cut to the bone, and the education side of the budget got increased, and I'm, you know, just making that up for illustration purposes, and then education wanted to use some of the town's resources, I can imagine them saying, look, we don't have those available. We can barely get done what we need to get done, and that, you know, creating a division of sorts between those. I mean, I don't know. I'm just hoping it's something you can look at.
If you look at the last time we did this, that was one of two areas that we debated a lot. Is if you go to the bifurcation route, you do risk, at least the impression was, shared services. So, yeah, Nick.
I understand the point, but I'm wondering how different it is from the situation we're in today, because as we go through multiple referenda, as we did on this last go-round, both sides are getting adjusted, some is being taken from Paul to go to Peter, and so forth and so on. That could still leave hard feelings at the end of the day in terms of, wait a second, I lost X number of thousands of dollars, and you didn't, so you can't have my truck anymore. I would hope that we'd be, that the respective groups would be above that, but it's a point we'll take it.
All right, quick question for you. Just from a voter intent standpoint, obviously you're the one who has to deal with, the Legislative Council has to deal with a failed budget. They have to make a decision. Would it be helpful, your opinion, if we had, putting bifurcation aside, would advisory questions help you with voter intent, particularly if you get feedback from both the Board of Ed side as well as the town side as to whether it's too high or too low, similar to what we had before?
I think what was offered by the last commission was as simple as the budget too high or is this budget's too low. And my opinion was that was more helpful than nothing. I don't think it is necessarily as helpful as is the education budget too high or is the education budget too low, but take into consideration I have those concerns about that model at the same time. So I haven't been presented with enough information about bifurcation with advisory questions to be able to draw a conclusion on that, but I think where we are now is not necessarily as helpful as it can be.
Okay. Any other questions? Michelle?
So I think in the last 4 referenda, voter intent was hard to determine. And at one point, I think it was Jeff suggested maybe voters email the legislative council members to get some idea. Was that helpful at all?
Yeah, it was helpful. I think but the problem I had was that many people who emailed me, and I can only speak for myself, are not people who are willing to speak publicly, nor were they people who wanted their intent to become public. So in the spirit of doing what the constituents, some of those constituents asked, you can't necessarily produce evidence to the fact that one side said this and one side said that, and still respect the fact. I mean, you know from being at public meetings, there's certain people who are willing to speak publicly and certain people who are not. So that being said, I found that, the people who did reach out to us were fairly split. But it's such a small number of people who are reaching out to us, I don't know that they fairly represented what was actually happening.
So if you had an advisory question that told you what percent of people were intending what by their vote, is that something that would help? Would that guide you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is, would only 20% of the people answer the advisory questions, in which case we'd be in a very similar boat to where we were this year with emails. If 100% of the no votes, let's say, answered an advisory question, and that would be a pretty clear indication of what was happening, but if 200 people answered advisory questions and the other 2,000 no votes didn't, I don't know that that would be helpful, but it wouldn't be more harmful than where we are now.
And another question is, so if the majority of voters said we want money added back, I know there were several legislative council members that said they were not in favor of adding money back after a failed referendum, and I'm not sure I understand the reasoning why for that. So if we had advisory questions, would that still hold true? I don't know, would that still be an issue, that the idea of adding money back to a budget?
I can't speak for other council members, so I'll tell you that my personal opinion is that this concept of voting no, it's too low is a fairly new concept. So for the people who were involved in that this year, it seemed pretty obvious, well, of course, we're voting no because it's too low. People should be hearing that. But because many, many years of tradition, voting no meant it's too high, and lack of information from the voters to really understand what the majority of those no votes meant, the obvious thing, in my opinion, was to go towards what traditionally the no vote has meant, plus the fact that I did not personally hear from a majority of voters that felt no means too high. The second thing to consider is the fact that even with the bifurcated model, a majority of the council will still have to, a supermajority of the council will still have to approve adding money back. So in the current model, this last 5 referenda we went through, the only way that was going to happen is if 8 of the 12 council members agreed to it, because that's what the charter says. That's still going to be true going forward, but if 2,000 people vote no and 1,800 of them said I voted no because it's too low, that's going to be a very different picture than what we saw the last year, at least a different picture than I saw.
Can I ask a question?
Answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Bob. Okay. Mary Ann, I thought I heard you just in passing make a comment about the questions being directed to the no voters. Wouldn't it be correct to direct the advisory question to all the voters, because someone who voted yes might vote no if it was raised or lowered? So you ought to know what the yes voters are thinking just as well as the no voters. Would that not be true?
I think that depends on what you're allowed to ask. My understanding in the past was the question has to be pretty conclusive. It has to be able to answer with a yes or no question. Are you voting yes for this budget because it's too high?
I don't think that's the case.
And if I can, I don't know what the answer to that question is. I mean, I would presume if you're voting yes, it's because you're saying yes, this is acceptable to me.
But you have to recognize the possibility that it's going to change if it's turned down, and the person who votes yes ought to have his opinion heard, it seems to me. I disagree.
So what would that question look like?
Well, there are
I'm not
questions.
sure I understand.
We already had questions in here that, for instance, the last budget, the last Charter Revision Commission recommended a vote that was yes, no, it's too high, or no, it's too low.
Correct.
And I think that's a very bad formulation. I think it should be yes or no. I mean, if we bifurcate it or if we don't, it should be yes or no, and then everybody gets an opportunity to say whether they think if the budget fails. This is how it was, 15, 20 years ago. If the budget fails, do you want to see it go up or do you want to see it go down? And those questions are relevant. But if you only ask the no voters, you don't get a full picture.
I think that's something your council is going to have to, your commission is going to have to debate.
Thank you.
So just so I clarify, Bob, what you're saying is regardless of whether you say yes or no, you're saying that advisory questions should be directed to both parties that vote yes or no?
Absolutely.
Okay. Any other questions? Jim?
I'm curious to know what your opinion is of the ability of the various budget makers to put together budgets that meet the goals and objectives that have been established by the council and the board, if you have these various questions in place. In other words, are asking these questions taking away from the people who are closest to the issues the ability to make good decisions about the budgeting?
Well, that's actually a very good question because, there's a process stands right now. The Board of Selectmen and the Board of Education put together a budget. It then goes to the Board of Finance, who looks at the mechanics of the budget and determines if there's places that money can be saved. And then it goes to the council, who really makes probably more of a political decision about what's acceptable to the voters. I can imagine that in the event that we approve bifurcation and advisory questions, there will be a group of people who say the budget shouldn't be touched once it's presented by the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Education, which could potentially, and if you use this year as an example, the Board of Finance, for example, was able to save an additional $700,000 from the time the budget was presented to them till they voted on it, which was a result of many moving parts that hadn't been in place when the Board of Education put the budget forward. So, that process of checks and balances is very important, I think, and has worked very well for this town over a number of years. So I can imagine there'd be some resistance to that, if that's your question. We haven't really ever given direction to those boards before a budget. For instance, to say next year we expect you to come in at, somewhere in this neighborhood, which is more about what a corporate model might do. That has never been something that we've done in the past.
Okay,
Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Yes.
Craig, you still have a question?
In looking at advisory questions, and you have a very basic, or what came through last time was no too high, no too low, and comparing that to, let's say, a bifurcated budget, if the advisory questions were more detailed, is there really much difference? Like if you were to have town side too high, too low, education side too high, too low, but it was still a single budget, I don't know if I see much difference between a bifurcated budget and detailed advisory questions, because they still have a potential divisive impact. So
what do I think?
Do you think the detailed advisory questions would be helpful?
I think, and I'm speculating, purely speculating, I think that is the budget too high or is the budget too low in itself sends a very clear picture that's a pure financial picture. And I do believe that a large number of no voters, it's purely a financial decision. It's not I don't support education or I don't support the municipal, it's I can't afford a tax increase answer. So I think while that's more helpful than we have today, what you'll find, it probably if you bifurcate it, is that people will be able to give a more clear answer on how they feel about the two separate sides of the budget, which may or may not prove illuminating, but would probably answer some questions out there for the public. Because I think many people's impression is we need to bifurcate because we really think the majority of people in town think education is important, and education will go through on the first try if we bifurcate. I don't know that the majority of the voters actually feel that way. I think, that's 80% of our budget dollars, really, when you include the debt service associated with it, and that's the largest part of our tax increases. And I think whether or not people support education, it doesn't necessarily reflect in whether or not they can afford a tax increase. I mean, there's many, many people we hear from every year who say, I have kids in the school, I support education, I believe in education, but I can't afford it. I can't pay another $50 a year. So you know, people, they have to split sort of what they feel and what reality is when it comes to voting or making a decision.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
Marianne, just to go back quickly to a point you made earlier where you had a scenario where you said that there were 2,000 no votes and 1,800 with advisory questions said no, too low. And you said that that would be very difficult. I don't understand.
No, I meant that would be very clear.
Oh,
If I said difficult,
sorry.
I didn't mean to say that. That would be very clear. My concern is that you're going to ask, one of the concerns is that you're going to ask advisory questions, but still only a few people are going to answer them. So you're not going to have something that's very clear. You're going to have 2,000 no votes, and you're still only going to get 200 people answering the advisory questions.
I'm sorry.
Okay. That will leave us in a similar pickle to where we are now. It'll be much clearer if everybody answers, but I don't know that you can force that. You're not going to be able to force everybody to fill in every bubble.
Could I respond to that?
You may.
We are given a lot of information, including about 6 years of advisory questions that were back in the 80s. And interestingly enough, just picking 1985 as an example, where there were approximately 2,900 votes, the advisory questions actually had over 2,000 votes, and the Board of Ed advisory question had 2,400 votes. So it's not a big drop-off.
That's good.
And that's true. That was true for all 5 or 6 years that we've been given.
Well, that's one of the reasons I asked those questions, because I think that kind of research, and when you come back to the council, will be important for me to be able to make personally an informed decision. So keep those things in mind.
We good?
Thank you.
Pat, do you want to go next? No problem.
Thank you, John. I have a child care issue, so I have to jump right in if you don't mind. I have some materials for you that I don't know right now. But it is going to be illustrative of some of the comments that I'm going to make. So I'm going to talk about this from a little bit of a different perspective than what Marianne has been sharing with you. So if you'll just hold on and I'll make one or two of the If you can just hold on and not go through them until I direct you to them, please.
We're eager.
As a former teacher, I know I always take a risk in passing out papers before you need to look at them. But what you're going to see is that I want you to try to look at the budget in 3 parts. And I think it's important when we talk about the total town budget to recognize that there are 3 significant components to the budget. And that really is illustrated on the top document of the package that I gave you. There is the municipal operations budget, the education operations budget, and debt service. And it's really important to separate those at least a little bit in your mind. And if you think back over this past budget season, I think you'll recognize that increasingly we talked about the budget in those 3 components, not just because it's important that we all focus on debt. We know what our state and nation has done in terms of our debt load. So it's important to keep that front and center, but also because of the impact it has on the budget. So here's my thinking. A budget that includes all debt service as part of the municipal operations budget is both a boon and a bane to the bottom line of the municipal budget. When debt service increases year over year, the impact of that increase then is felt as part of the municipal budget. When debt service decreases, the municipal budget benefits. I think that that's an unevenness that we should address and hopefully we have an opportunity to address. And each of those situations that I talk about, the impact of increased debt and the benefit of decreased debt has happened over the last couple of years. And you'll see that on the second page of the materials that I gave you. Now, these really are for your packet, and I know that you'll look at these at your leisure. But if you just look at that second page, you'll see that year over year, for example, starting in 2007, from 2007 to 2008, the debt service budget increased by 15.7%. Now, what you have in front of you is a chart that illustrates what each of the three components of the budget look like as standalone entities. But if you were to roll the debt service increase into the municipal budget, which is how it's typically done, then it shows an inordinate increase in the municipal operations budget, which isn't really an increase in the operational budget. It's an increase in debt. Debt that the community has committed to by taking on large projects. And then in 2009-10, debt decreased by 5.2%. And in that year, the municipal operations budget got the benefit of that. So we could have increased our budget substantially and still have come in at a negative number because we could have taken on the advantage of decreased debt. So I think the increase in debt is certainly a bane to the municipal budget, and a decrease in debt is a boon. I'm saying either circumstance I don't think is a fair circumstance when you're talking about the cost to operate the municipality. I don't advocate that either side of the budget bear the debt service cost for its projects. So I'm not advocating that you assign to the education budget the debt for education projects. I'm not suggesting that at all. Or that you assign to the municipal budget the debt for municipal projects. If you were to do that, the third document in this packet shows you a little bit what that would look like. That document that's actually a 12-year retrospective of the budget with debt service divided, how it would be assigned to the education budget versus the municipal budget. Again, I'm not advocating it. I'm just showing you how that breaks out. And there's reason to be concerned if we assign to those budgets the impact of the choices that the municipality has made to improve its infrastructure. Its facilities, its roads, its buildings, all of those things are part of our debt. So we own that as a municipality, as a community. So it's my position that the operational budget should be separated from the debt service budget. Active and penetrating analysis of costs for servicing the community, both in terms of a municipality and an educational system, are more relevant, more pointed, more direct, and more focused when we don't hide debt in that budget. I think it's important to peel it out and say, this is the cost, this is what we're asking to fund the municipality next year. This is what's going to cost for park and rec, for police, for public works, and not try to roll debt in there either as an added benefit or as an added cost. Separate it out. It really provides a much more focused analytical opportunity for justifying the municipal budget. So I'm hopeful that a charter review process to immediately follow this one will take an additional step, and that would be that we would act with our annual budget referenda. We will have bonded projects. We'll ask the voters to say thumbs up or thumbs down on those projects that would be part of our capital debt. We don't do that right now. Right now we act on those projects in a town meeting format, which is probably not the most effective mechanism available to us to solicit community input. So I'm saying it's time for us to make that big move. I know that's beyond the scope of this group, but I'm really saying let's really be smart about how we look at our budget now, and debt is a significant component. So let's be smart about that, but let's also shift some of that opportunity to make the community more aware of how that debt generates, how we created that debt by putting that as a part of our regular budget referenda process. Here's where I think we are right now. I think our current process certainly has lack of clarity in voter intent. No with an intention to increase, or no with an intention to decrease. I think this year, for the first time in all the years that I've been living in Newtown, I really heard that message more consistently than I had ever heard before, that there is a population of voters who was voting no because they were unhappy that the budget was too low. They wanted more resources, and particularly in the education area. So I know we're looking at three options, essentially: bifurcation, advisory, or some combination therein. So what you have here, what I'm going to share with you in a minute, I'll leave my comments with you. I think that each of those strategies has pluses and minuses. Bifurcation alone, I think, does help and clarify voter intent. I also think it can be very divisive. And then you face the additional challenge: is it binding or non-binding? So let's say you have a bifurcated budget, and I'm going to take that position to say, okay, the town budget passes, the municipal operations budget passes, and the education budget does not. The second piece of that is it binding? Do you then have a municipal budget that is secure and only put the education back to a second referenda, or do you say we don't have a budget and both those budgets go back? That's a choice. And some of the communities that bifurcate have made one kind of choice, and other communities have made a different kind of choice. So that will be a choice that you'll confront if you decide to bifurcate. Advisory, pluses and minuses, provides more clarity on voter intent, and then you have to address that issue. It's not binding. So it doesn't bind you, and it gives you some suggestions, but it's not binding. So you're still playing that kind of guessing game. You know, how much to increase or decrease. You know, that it provides greater intent, but it's still very soft. A combination of bifurcation and advisory probably provides the most clarity about voter intent, but then you still get back into that issue of binding versus non-binding. And that can be a very sticky issue. Now, you can imagine this was part of the discussion of the charter revision group, I'm sure John will remember, last time, is that if you did bifurcate and decided to not have a binding vote on whichever of those pieces of the budget that might have been successful, then in fact, are you invalidating the voters? Are you saying to those voters, you said this, but we say, no, we're going to start all over again? So you really have to confront that issue. So it's no secret that I've been concerned for a long time about any format other than the current format we have going to the voters for our annual funding request. I think it invites competition if we bifurcate. Even with advisory questions, I think it invites that opportunity to compete. It also provides a platform for special interests. It provides extensive opportunity for those who want to manipulate and politicize, and I think we saw a lot of that over the last couple of months. I think there's lots of evidence that the temptation to manipulate and politicize is real. And it strongly discourages cooperation and collaboration. And I believe those circumstances to be especially strong and relevant during times of economic stress. And we certainly are in that position right now. However, there is a however here. This past budget season has absolutely persuaded me, and sadly so, that my vision of one community, one budget, supporting commonly held values is probably not attainable. So the pragmatic side of me says we don't want to be going through again what we went through this past year or this budget development season. It's been stressful, harmful, I think hurtful, and it really put us in a position where we're uncertain even about how to make any choices going forward. For the first time, again, in a long time, I felt like I didn't have any direction at all. I simply did not know how to go forward. So we cannot, individually, as your CEO, I'm saying this was very unhealthy for our community. We don't want to do this again. So we need to find a process that provides the council and our citizenry with more clarity, more information about the choices, but we also need to be very careful to watch out for those negative aspects of bifurcation and advisory, and I think they're real. So I think we don't want to tap into that culture and that climate we have now of animosity. So I don't envy you this task, because I think that there's a real, there's some opportunity here, but there's also some danger. So I wish you good luck in your endeavors. Happy to answer any questions you might have.
Do you have time, Pat?
I do.
Okay.
Could I ask a question?
Yeah, Bob.
Pat, the I'm going to eventually ask everybody why they think a bifurcated budget is divisive, but my observation, and I'd like your comment on this, is that if you don't have it bifurcated, then you have to vote no on everything if you feel strongly enough about one side or the other being either too high or too low. So the persons who thought the Board of Ed budget was too low and voted no, therefore impacted on the general budget as well, even though they might have been perfectly happy to see the general town budget approved. So there's a big advantage, it seems to me, to bifurcate the questions, and I don't know why it's assumed that having a bifurcated question is going to create division between the Board of Ed and the town side of the electorate. It just, to me, it gives you more opportunity to express yourself rather than less, and if I have to vote against the entire budget because I think the one side or the other made a mistake, that's not helpful.
Well, I might be wrong, Bob, with my concern that it becomes divisive. Part of my concern is that, again, I trust that the checks and balances that Mary Ann spoke about are really effective, that the budgets, as they work their way through the system, through the Board of Finance and through the Legislative Council, really end up being a spending plan that reflects fairly what is needed to support the community, both on the municipal side and the education side. I really truly believe that. I'm part of the process. I'm intimately aware of how those meetings go and how difficult those meetings are, but how analytical the process is and the rigor that all the members of the Board of Finance and Legislative Council apply to that process, and the confidence that they have ultimately, that they've done their due diligence, that in fact they are presenting to the community a budget that they feel both financially and politically meets the needs of the community. So I really stand behind that action. I say, okay, I think the work they do is really good work. So when we then fracture that and give people the opportunity then to second guess all of that work that was done by the Board of Finance or the Legislative Council, it feels to me that is an unhealthy division. Now, I might be wrong, Bob. Certainly this past couple of months has been a pretty unhealthy division without bifurcation. So I might be overly concerned about that, and it's just part of my nature. I've had this vision for a long time and I'm also an educator, so it's kind of that passion I have that this community really cares about education, but also really understands the needs to serve a diverse population by having good roads, a good library, parks and recreation, a safe community, that all of those things are important, and that we can't have winners and losers. We can't say this is a big pile and this is a little pile, that your needs here as a senior citizen aren't as important or as relevant for funding as are the needs of our K-12 population. I don't believe our community feels that way. I choose to believe that we can go forward together, but I think that perhaps I'm not right.
Any additional questions? Michelle?
So you were talking about having 3 parts to the budget, and I think New Milford does something similar to that in that they have the education part, the town part, and then they put their debt service separately, and they have advisory questions. But they don't have advisory questions for the debt service.
Well, you really can't. Debt is debt. You can't choose to decrease it. You know, it is what it is. A bill is a bill. So I really am suggesting something of that nature. Okay. Yes.
Yes. Nick?
I've had similar thoughts about the debt service. And the conclusion that I've come to, and John Courts may challenge me on this, we don't vote on the debt service.
Correct.
We just don't vote. I mean, that's there, and it needs to be paid. Everything else in the budget, both sides, is negotiable, fungible, can be adjusted. We do have contracts we have to live to, but you can always reduce headcount to affect those. But the debt service is the debt service. it could be, although mentioned on a ballot as the amount that it is, it could, in my judgment, be easily taken out of both sides, and you would be voting then on the operations for both the town and the Board of Ed, just as you suggested.
That clearly is the direction that I would want to go in, and I think in doing that, George, what it does is really isolate the operational costs in such a way that you can really examine all the aspects of that budget, and not get confused by this bottom line thing that has an extra $9 or $10 million in it. And because it's a significant amount of money. The debt is a significant amount of money. I mean, one of the examples, if you look at this this kind of scratch sheet, that's the top document here, you'll see that this year, the budget that was just successfully passed, the municipal operations budget is actually decreased by $130,000. If the debt service were to be calculated as part of that municipal budget, then it would look as if the municipal budget increased, because the debt service increased by $337,000. So if that were rolled into the municipal budget, as it usually is, someone could walk away thinking that, oh, the budget for the municipality has increased, when in fact it has not. What has increased is the cost of our debt. So again, that's a reason. There's lots of reasons, I believe, to isolate the debt. Also, I think it's too easy to forget that you've created debt when you hide it in somebody else's budget. I think we have to confront our debt as a community all the time.
Craig?
Well, this packet you presented, and kind of building on what you just said, the numbers can be confounding. Especially to somebody who doesn't work with numbers. You know, so if you're going to present breaking out debt service and showing operational budgets, it's fair to conclude a lot of people aren't even going to understand it. And you know, the town budget is the only place where individuals actually vote on a number, right? Everywhere else, it's representative government, right? You're voting on people to pick the number for you. You know, how close do you feel people should be to that budget process? You know, where's a good place to put them?
I understand what you mean, and I know not everyone is a numbers person. I think there is a way to do that, though, to isolate, to take debt out. And that's very similar to what happened a little bit this year. You know, there was an additional element in this year's budget, and that there was a budgeted contribution to fund balance. And that really is that's in taxation, but it wasn't in the municipal budget or the education budget. It was just a taxation element. So I think there's a way to structure it. I think, you know, this group and the bright minds of our finance director and business manager could come up clearly with ways to describe what we're asking voters to vote on without confusing them. I have confidence in that.
Any other questions? Michelle?
So we received a packet from the previous charter
Yes.
commission, and you had provided them with, and I think Bob mentioned it, the voting records from the 1980s where there were advisory questions.
That's right.
Do you know why why we got rid of that? What the history is on that?
Well, I was hoping Bob might refresh our memory a little bit on that. I can tell you that during much of that time I was on the Board of Education, and we didn't like them at all. So we were very happy when they went away. So no, I don't know why. There was a charter revision. There were several charter revisions during that period of time, and in one of those charter revisions, the process was changed. So that would have had to have been a recommendation of a charter review panel, and the voters accepted that recommendation, and that change was made. But I think if you spend some time looking at that material, you'll see also that there is a reference to the point that Bob Hall made earlier, in that there was a question that says you vote straight up on the budget, yes or no, but then the next column, if this budget is defeated, would you want it to be increased or decreased totally, or would you want education increased or decreased, or municipal funding increased or decreased? I think there's lots of iterations. So when I put that packet together for the previous panel, I thought it was really interesting to see how the spread of questions changed over the years. There are other examples I didn't include in there. I think in one charter review commission considered years ago that it would be permissive that the legislative, well, there was no council at this time, it was the Board of Selectmen, but now it would be the council would make an annual choice whether or not to divide the budget or to ask advisory questions. So it wasn't required as part of the process, but it was permissive. So there's been lots of discussion and lots of approaches. What's also interesting, if you look at those materials, is that we routinely seem to have trouble in Newtown passing the budget on the first go. So there are many instances where there's been multiple referenda over the 12 or so years that I've looked at this process.
Jim?
Pat, think about what would happen in the time leading up to a budget vote if we have a bifurcated budget, and what do you think would be the impact on the activities of those folks who advocate for the Board of Education's budget or the town side budget? Do you see any changes in the way those activities would take place given a bifurcated budget?
Perhaps, probably not so much for the education budget, because I think there is a strong constituency and advocacy around that budget already. I think that would not necessarily be the case for the municipal budget. There's not very many advocates for public works, or it's hard to rally people around wanting good roads and that kind of thing. So I think that it will be a challenge for the municipality to generate those constituencies around that budget. So we'd have to rely upon the good faith of the community and understanding that those needs are important as well. What I think will, in fact, help both budgets is when we put our capital, when we put projects to be bonded on our annual referenda, our budget referenda process. I think that will help both budgets. It will increase voter participation when we have those questions on our annual budget referenda. I think it increases participation and also focuses people a little bit more on some of those broader issues. So if you fast forward into the future, think about the kinds of things we might be putting on a document, which I know is beyond your scope here, but it would be around, a senior center, open space, a community center, those kinds of things that are in our CIP right now that kind of go through this town meeting process without much engagement of people. Those projects then would find themselves on the annual budget referenda. So those constituents would have more of an advocacy role to get people to the polls to help them understand the need to vote and support for those items. So I'm looking at this as a two-step kind of process.
How are we doing for time for you?
We're okay. I have a babysitter till 8:30.
Let me follow up a little bit. If people are voting if the education community is voting and really out there getting the votes out for the education budget, I can see a scenario whereby the education budget would pass overwhelmingly, and the municipal budget, if it passes at all, might go down.
Good.
Based on the idea that the mill rate shouldn't go beyond a certain level, and therefore, if we want dollars in our budget,
right,
we have to have fewer dollars in another budget. Is that a viable scenario in your mind?
Absolutely. And there's real concern around that. I'm a strong education supporter and want schools to be funded well, but I don't want that to happen at the expense of roads or seniors or our library or those other services that make our community what it is. Our community has to be more than just a good education program. And again, I'm fearful a little bit for the town that there will be, and that's the divisiveness I'm talking about, that there might be a perception that in order to get this big slice of the pie, I have to take it from this small slice of the pie. So I think that all of us, if we end up with any kind of a bifurcated budget, we're going to have to be courageous enough and honest enough to the process to speak for the needs of the entire community. And we have to be okay with that. I'm very strong. I'm not at all cautious about speaking in favor of education, but I also will speak strongly in favor of the needs to have good roads, a senior center, good parks and recreation, all of those other qualities that make us the kind of community that we are, remembering that we have a diverse population that draws on all of those services. And we have to do it all. We have to find a way to do it all and do it all well.
Tony?
You mentioned before when you were on the Board of Ed that you did not like the advisory questions. Have we reached a place now that where you have an opinion one way or the other that a bifurcated budget would favor one side of the budget passing or another? Has the politics changed?
I don't think the politics have changed very much. I think there's a very strong value in our community around education, and I'm happy to say that. So the only reason we didn't like it is we're always nervous about it. Nervous that the decrease would outweigh the increase. Advisory. So I don't think the politics truly in our community have changed much. I think what has changed is increasing stress around taxation. And the real challenge that we all have to find ways to get a grip on taxation. Connecticut, New England, Newtown, all of us are feeling the stress of constantly increasing taxes that are imposed on us without a commensurate increase in services. And the only place that we have to really make a difference in that taxation is at the local level. There's not much you can do about the state, and there's nothing you can do about the federal government. So we only feel it here locally. So, and that message is okay. I think certainly the Board of Selectmen has heard that loud and clear. I know the Board of Finance has, the Council has, and I know the Board of Ed has, that we've got to get a grip on that. So that's the big political theme right now, is that we have X dollars, but we have X plus Y expenses, and we've got to find a way to marry the two.
Any other questions for Pat? Think you're good?
Thanks.
Thanks, Carmen. So, Debbie or John, who would like to go first?
Hello.
Hi, Debbie.
Debbie Lideline, 29 Littlebrook Lane. I am the chairman of the Board of Education, and I'd like to start the same way Mary Ann did and say that the opinions that I share here tonight are my opinions and not necessarily the opinions of the board. The nice thing about going after others is you can say that you echo many of the points that they brought up. Many of Mary Ann's concerns are concerns that I also have, whether it be a binding or a non-binding vote. If one passes and the other doesn't, it certainly could have detrimental effects to the other side if it were a binding vote. I think that with the recent Bloom-Shapiro report that was presented to the Legislative Council and the Board of Education in the spirit of collaboration, I think that will be something that we would have to work very hard to figure out how is that going to work with regard to the budgets. How will that be represented in each side's budget? I guess one of the questions that that I would have is with regard to advisory questions being too high or too low, there's still the question of how much. We can see that the Legislative Council in the past has made decisions with regard to that question, and that has not, it's caused in some cases much more controversy than actually solving the problem. So I guess that would be one question that, does it really provide that amount of clarity? If people answer that question, they could mean all different ranges of that amount. So I think that it still means that the council has to make a judgment with regard to that question. The other question that I have is, and I know I'm not supposed to be asking you questions, you're supposed to be asking me questions.
That's okay.
In the last budget, we clearly had a divide with regard to voting, particularly when it came to the education budget. And both sides claimed that they were the majority and that the council should listen to them. There was the voters who said it's too low, the education budget is too low, and there was the voters who said it was too high. And so I guess I don't know how that would be handled if it came out that it was somewhat, and not exactly identical, but a pretty even amount. And I don't know how the council would read that or interpret that or handle that type of situation. What would be the outcome of that? So I guess those are some of the questions that I have. Do you have questions for me?
Anyone? So Debbie, you don't think that any kind of advisory questions, that they're explicit enough, or at least give guidance for everyone who is impacted?
Again, I do think that they give guidance, particularly with, why the majority of the voters voted the way that they did. However, it still leaves a judgment call on the council's part, and we could still go back and forth with different referenda trying to get that amount correct and where people would feel comfortable voting for the budget.
And then a follow-up question is, obviously, because the Board of Ed is a big chunk of the budget of the town, if you bifurcate, how much will that affect all the shared services strategy that's going to happen over the next 2-3 years? Will it make it that much more difficult for that to happen?
I can't answer that without, I would have to speak to the different business directors to find out if they would have to put a plan into place and how to divide the cost of those services based on who was handling those, which side was handling those services and what the benefit was to each side. So I can't honestly answer if that would be detrimental or not. It would certainly, I think, make it a little more difficult to do so and to represent it in the correct way in both sides' budget. And then if you have to reduce on one side, what does that mean for if that's a shared service?
Okay. Any questions for Debbie? Michelle?
I know that one of the guiding factors in determining how much to reduce the budget by after the failed referendum was what the margin was, the difference between yes voters and no voters. So could you use that to determine how much, if you had advisory questions and there were...
Right, but they made that decision and then some people said, well, you did too much, and other people said it wasn't enough. So, it's still, while you can make that decision and make that reduction, does it still mean a passed referenda? And I think we've seen through experience that that's not the case.
Any other questions for Debbie? I think we're good. Thanks, Debbie. John?
John Courts, 2,500 Acres Road. I'm going to take a different approach. First of all, the last time we had a charter revision, and having done budgets for 18 years now, I've been through a few of them, budgets for Newtown. What I think I should preface my comments by saying is I'll echo the same things that I said in this room a couple years ago. I don't think it's the Board of Finance's role to weigh into what I think you're dealing with, which is a pretty political type of discussion. This is the purview of the council. They set up this board, this commission. It's their role to really kind of take what you look in. You have a daunting task, but as I said in the last time, I'm not going to weigh in, nor has the Board of Finance talked about any of these issues about what would be better or what would be worse. I can summarize some of the issues that have been important to us that mechanically may affect what you do. But politically, you know, this is beyond our purview, okay? Contrary to what was presented in the patch the last go-around, I did not weigh in one way or the other on bifurcation, good or bad, up or down. I was very ambivalent because I don't think it's our role to weigh in on that. So from my perspective and from what the Board of Finance has talked about, I'd offer you a couple things to consider, many of which have been talked about tonight already, but there's some that need to be reiterated. If you're going to separate things, you know, that's clearly something that you can look at some of the data and some of the history on it. That's a recommendation that you need to make. There is a concern, though, that I would have from a mechanical point of view about what you do with debt and what Pat said. And Mr. Schmidt, although I will agree with you, I don't disagree with your comment. You have to handle that carefully in whatever your recommendation end up being, whether it's this time or the next time. Because if you are going to separate or recommend to separate, then you have to have an understanding of where those costs are. It's becoming more complicated with things like debt. If we build a bridge, should that go on Pat's side of the budget? If we build an addition to a school or put in an HVAC system, should that go on the Board of Education side? Or should you separate it out completely? Mechanically, in what we deal with, I would think if that were the recommendation, then you probably would do the town well in putting those projects on the ballot so it's ultimately clear. You follow me? Mechanically, in my experience, being a voter and also dealing with budgets, were you not to have those on the ballot and break them out, you'd have to some way put them into each of the separate budgets. And I think as we get into the 21st century with shared services and things of that nature, that's going to become more and more opaque, all right, and harder to split out. So were that your recommendation, I would recommend that you consider how to make that more clear. And from a mechanical perspective and our just dealing with it year after year, that to me, were that your option, would make it ultimately clear and really put it in the hands of the voters. Which brings me to another point. The Board of Finance, and I'm going on the thesis that we're talking, or the conversation or the theme that we're talking about separating to some degree, whether you choose to do that or not, recommend that or not. If you were to do that, how do we handle contributions to fund balance? I don't know. Is that a whole separate issue? And my concern, and to Craig's point before, which the question fascinated me, is how close do you put the voter to all of this in their understanding? I'm not sure the voter understands fund balance, okay? I'm not sure the voter understands the benefits of contributing to fund balance. That's not because they're not informed. That's not because they're not bright. When I started doing this 18 years ago, I walked into a meeting, I was elected to the council, there was a slap on the back, and there was a general understanding of the direction that we would be heading in, okay? Today, there's an awful lot of information out there, and it's changed dramatically. But to that end, and this is a part that I think is totally devoid from these conversations, and from my personal perspective, unfortunately so, we have a representative form of government, to your point, Mr. Lehecka. At some level, those that are elected to represent need to be able to make some of the decisions. And from my perspective, and speaking for myself specifically, That's an important part of charter revision that oftentimes get overlooked. And I made the same comment last time. I was chastised for it, but speaking for myself, we're all elected to be informed, to understand the information, and recommend what's in the best interest of Newtown. So if you're going to break these things out, how do you handle fund balance? From my perspective and the Board of Finance perspective, just looking at the votes that we made, it's critical. It's absolutely critical. And if we're going to be talking about a couple $100,000 in a budget referendum difference on what the town is debating between, Board of Ed, robbing from Peter to pay Paul, however you want to describe it, the absence of a concerted contribution in fund balance and prudent fiscal policy could end up with a 20-year price tag. That's how important fund balance or these types of things are. So I think if you're going to do it, does that go in Pat's budget? Does it get appropriated proportionately? I don't know the answer to it. But my point is that if we're going to talk about these things, where does that end up? Because that's something that's relatively new in our discussions as of late, and for very important reason. And the reason why it's important is because it affects the interest rates that we pay. And when we borrow, it's a 20-year obligation. And I think you can't overlook that. I think that's critical. Shared services is another big issue. I'm not sure how you handle that, but it's certainly in the taxpayers and the town's best interest to move in that direction. So how do you break those out? And by the way, there's a lot of shared services that have been going on in this town well before we had this Bloom-Shapiro study. Park and Rec is a classic example. How do you break that apart? I don't know how you handle that. I don't know where you end up with that, but it's another issue that kind of makes this a little bit more opaque. Insofar as what we do as a Board of Finance, those are the things that I think mechanically should be considered. They're devoid of opinion because they are going to have an impact, either depending upon which way you handle them. But I do think that I think those are some of the mechanical issues that we would struggle with. I think there's a host of issues that are outside of your initial charge that a charter revision should really consider taking a look at. But I'm not going to speak to those, and I didn't the last time because you're charged, and I know you have a very tight schedule. So that's from our perspective. I feel comfortable speaking on behalf of the Board of Finance from that. Again, I think it's devoid of opinion. I think a lot of what you're talking about is political in nature, but these political decisions will impact how you operate, and I think those should weigh. My recommendation is you consider those in your deliberations and your recommendation. So,
any questions for John?
Nick? John, fund balance, good point. I'm under the perhaps erroneous impression that the large contribution to fund balance was part of a 2-year or a 3-year effort to get to a certain level. Do you foresee fund balance adjustments, contributions being made in perpetuity, or is this a one or a couple time thing?
Well, Nick, what I prefer to focus on when I'm trying to make a decision is what I know versus what I don't know, okay? And what I know is fund balance is important. What I know is that in comparable towns, we're not where we should be, and that's what rating agencies look at. What I know is the Board of Finance made a recommendation that was a little aggressive this past year, and somewhere along the way it was reduced by half, and in the final iteration it was reduced by $100,000, which, speaking for myself, was not a good idea. It's also one of the reasons why I think should a budget fail, and this is a classic example, that the Board of Finance in its advisory role, as the charter stands now, is out of the discussion. It's only through the courtesy of Jeff Capisi and the council inviting us to come back in, which we did the first time, and the second time, the Board of Finance has no say after that, but we have to deal with the consequences. The council and the Board of Finance has also developed a policy which has some attachments to state statute that compel the Board of Finance to come up with plans and make recommendations based on policies that we have, and puts the burden solely on us. So without the ability to kind of revisit those issues in a proper forum, our hands are tied behind our back. We don't even have a voice, which to me is not appropriate. But to your point, my suggestion would be, is that fund balance can be contributed to in a number of ways, two of which we saw this past budget season. One is from positive impacts of the policies that we have saving us money, and the other is making a concerted and specific decision to raise taxes to make that contribution beyond savings that we found, okay? The other way that that can happen is we add more to our tax roll than we budgeted. Okay, one of the charter revision changes in the past is it allows the town to manage that fund balance. We didn't used to have that ability. That's why some of this is sweeping into the fund balance at this point, because we've made a collective and democratic, decision to do that amongst the various boards. My suggestion, the answer to your question would be, I would expect it to continue until we get on par with comparable towns of our similar rating. So in perpetuity, I wouldn't say that. But for the next few years and foreseeable future, and should we fall on more difficult times and that be difficult, absolutely, absolutely. I would expect that to be a common theme in the next handful of budgets going forward, at a minimum.
John, I may have misunderstood you, but my understanding of the debt service is that once the project is approved and the town becomes and the town then spends the money that's appropriated, the debt service is, as basically as Nick said, it's going to have to be done. You have to pay your debt service. So why would the voter get a chance to vote payment of the debt service up or down? I may have misunderstood you.
No, what I said is that if we're going, or my observation would be that if you're going, the way that we do it now is we put it right in the budget.
Right.
Okay? And to your point, Nick, is that if we go to a referendum with the new project, there's the old debt service and there's the incremental interest and principal on whatever we're planning on doing. So in theory, that's voted on.
I thought you meant, when you said it, I thought you meant it would be put into each of these annual budgets. You didn't mean that. You meant it would be voted on when we appropriated the money for the project.
Well, that occurs amongst the council and the Board of Finance, but my point is that if you're going to separate debt out, as Pat was speaking to, which I think is certainly has merit in discussion, that if you're going to do that, I think the town would be better served, just in my experience, in taking it that step farther, and whatever those. For example, it's not uncommon when we go to borrow money or when we put a budget together that there's a bridge in there, that there's a middle school roof in there. That there's usually a handful of things. It's also not uncommon that once they're approved, in fact, this is more commonplace, that even if something's been approved prior, and then we have new stuff, that we lump it all together when we go to market and issue our bonds. My comment was that if you're going to consider breaking that out, it certainly would warrant the discussion to actually putting those individual projects on the ballot at that time. So
back when it's appropriated.
Actually at the referendum, which I think some of the discussion is centering around, as I understand it.
Not the budget referendum, but when these projects are actually appropriated.
Bob, my understanding is that we are not solely advisory as a Board of Finance. We actually do play a special, a legislative role because we have a role in the special appropriation, which sometimes I think is confused. And then it goes to the council and they make that special appropriation. If that's a net new project, as I understand it, and this is just my observation, some of the concern is that, and maybe to what Nick was pointing to before, is that money ends up in the budget and kind of is, for lack of a better word, very gray. You don't know what the projects are. You just see a lump number that adds to the selectmen's side of the budget. So my point is that if you're going to consider trying to make that more clear, that special appropriation process yields a net increase in debt service at the following referendum. It may be helpful in that following referendum for you to consider adding those projects at that point.
So you wouldn't actually be able to add the project until we had the annual budget referendum the way you're speaking.
It's not my opinion. I'm just saying mechanically that's my understanding, and you should take that up in your deliberations.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for John? Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks, John. Let's see. I think I asked if Paul or Dan could speak tonight, right? Of course, why you got called is you knew the Legislative Council, so I wanted your opinion on, what happened this year
Okay.
and how you think charter revision would help. There you go.
I'm a new member of the council this year, so I got thrown into the fire right away. Basically, after the first referendum, when the council decided to take away the $1 million from the education budget, I think things went downhill from there very quickly. We kind of didn't get a sense, we had no sense of who was voting yes, who was voting no. Yes meant no, no meant yes. And so I'm of the opinion that anything that you people did, whether advisory questions or bifurcating, is going to help us, period. Because we were clueless as to what people wanted.
Yeah, I guess the question I always have is I think a lot of this is part of discerning what voter intent is. And I, for one, this year was really confused and frustrated by what happened, which is why I signed up for another shot at this. So that's how you felt this year.
Yeah, that's how I felt. Right.
And the guidance that you got from constituents via emails or phone calls, did it just add to the confusion or?
Well, basically, every referendum, it was basically the same school supporters were the ones who sent out the majority of the emails, with a scattering of people who voted no, and they told us yes, that, they voted no because no meant no, period. That was there. No increase meant no increase. That kind of came about probably after the school supporters said no meant yes. They were voting no because they wanted an increase.
Any questions for Dan? Go ahead, Alan.
I want to go back to a question that Michelle and then Debbie, unfortunately has left, raised in earlier discussion, and that is, okay, so you had 600 or 700 no votes in the first referendum failure, right? Correct? Yeah. What process led you to infer the $1 million cut?
It was probably one of the biggest no votes in recent history. That was basically why the $1 million cut.
Any follow-on questions? Sure. Michelle?
Do you ever see us, if there were non-binding advisory questions, do you ever foresee overriding what the voters' intent is with that?
I personally don't know. If the advisory question said that the budget was too low, and the advisory questions came out that way, we would have to honor how the questions were answered.
Even if you thought it was bad for the town, if you thought it would be bad for the town, would that? If they were non-binding advisory questions, I'm just wondering whether if non-binding.
I also am of the opinion that if you're going to have the advisory questions, there should be give them some teeth to them and make them make them binding.
Any other questions for Dan? Thanks, Dan.
You're welcome.
Paul, do you want to come up? You don't have to. It's up to you. Sure. You put us up here.
Hi, everybody. Paul Lundquist, 148 Currituck Road. Well, my opinions are my own. I'm not representing the council, although I am on the legislative council. I guess one general comment is, in thinking about what the overall objectives for this group are, I guess there's two things. One is to provide a clear voice for the voter so that we can understand what their intent is as the legislative council. And the more practical side to that is the council having a clear way to interpret what that vote is. So with that being the overarching objective, it seems that maybe the beginning point would be how to satisfy that objective. And that, in my mind, is bifurcation. I mean, having said that, there are a lot of practical reasons why bifurcation maybe should not be implemented. So the process that you guys will all go through is to, we heard some of those factors tonight. Their concerns, their fears, but I think you should identify them as factors and use your research and your own judgment in your deliberations, but primarily your research and seeing what other towns have done. Is there real reason to fear that it would be divisive in other cases who have done this? We're not doing this in a vacuum here, and we're not the only ones going down this path. So I think that that's a really important point, is to take everyone's fears and concerns and just isolate them as things to consider, and then use your research to determine, do they play a role in ratcheting back from that ultimate answer of bifurcation? And I don't know the answer to that, and I don't even really have a clear opinion because I don't know the facts of what would drive that decision. So I would be very happy with whatever your answer is, as long as the process, in my mind, went through that kind of logical checks and balances.
Any questions for Paul? Jim?
Paul, we're talking about clarity for the voters and clarity for the council decision makers, and doing things that would enhance the clarity that doesn't seem to exist right now. Isn't part of this also to reduce the number of referendums that the community goes through? I mean, it seems to me,
having gone through 5, yes.
Well, I've been in this town for 35 years, and I've been watching this off and on during those years, and I find it disturbing that there are so many referendums that we have to go through, which it seems to me adds to the confusion, doesn't take away from it. So when we talk about the charge to the committee and looking at these things, although clarity is the primary focus, it seems to me that in the background is also a hope that what we come up with will reduce the need for multiplicity of referendums. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, I think that's really one of the ideals in pursuing whatever the solution is, but I'm not sure that bifurcation necessarily reduces the number of referendum just because it provides clarity. I think you'd have to take a look and see what other towns have experienced. It could be that there's a whole set of external factors that drove the number of referendum that we went through this year. The economy is certainly a factor. I think, there was, a real social element to it this year that maybe, will be different the next time this comes up, or it will be different 2 years from now. I think there might be a whole set of external factors that year by year could drive the number of referendum that we have to deal with. So whether or not bifurcation or advisory questions can really be, the golden egg to solve that issue, I'm not sure. But I agree, it's an ideal. If you could find evidence of it, that might lead you in one direction.
Thanks.
Bob? I have a question. I really liked what you said about our job, or if we can, to find out based on research whether there really is a reason to believe that a bifurcation is divisive. Do you have any insight on that as you sit here now? Do you have any insight on towns that you think we should look to, or whether you've had some anecdotal reports from other towns where it was or was not divisive?
Honestly, I'd have to say no.
Okay.
I'm not
okay.
in that seat to have done any of the real hands-on
okay.
research. Yeah.
That's okay. I just wondered.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Paul? Tony?
Paul, is there a line where you think that by either the advisory questions or making them binding, or whatever these iterations that we go through, where you think we've kind of taken away the voters' intent and when they elected you to make these decisions? I mean, do you have an opinion on that? I mean, is there a certain line where you think, hey, wait a minute, that's what I was elected to do, and now you've boxed me in?
I think that's a really important consideration, and for me personally, really based on that factor alone, and I don't know about any of the external research, what it might say is the real case, but my ingoing opinion is that I would prefer it to be advisory for that very reason, because I think there comes a time in the process where there could be a political faction that's driving the vote, and we as the council would need to recognize that and say, you know what, you're leading the entire town down a bad path, and we're put here to sort of be, the protectors of that. And there's a line. It's a fine line, and I don't think it would be very clear or obvious or could be predetermined, but I think that flexibility would need to be there.
Any other questions for Paul? Michelle?
So are you saying that having it binding would take away that flexibility?
Yes.
Anything else? Thanks, Paul.
If I could just add one more thing. There was also some discussion of how to handle debt and perhaps putting capital projects on the ballot. And I think that there's some, probably not specifically your charge here, but just to put the idea out there, I think that could be, we'd really have to think about how to implement that kind of thing, because if there are 8 capital projects to be put on a ballot and they're listed in alphabetical order, we're putting a lot of burden on the public to understand why they're important, why they should be there, and I can imagine a whole lot of voters just saying, well, we don't need all of these, so I'm going to check off the first 4. And so there's all kinds of bias that could be, built into our referendum just by the way we present these options to people, and I think that's an important consideration.
Yeah. Go ahead, Nick.
I would agree with that. But I think there could be some sort of a cutoff magnitude-wise. A capital project to get a new truck would not fall below that level. Build a new high school would be above that level. So I think there have to be some selection in terms of the projects that you'd actually want to put on the ballot.
That's the ideal, but then there would be some arbitrary cutoff of what capital items are important and what aren't to the public. Yeah, that too. Yep. But just a consideration.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thanks.
Those are the invited guests. I see Bob and Dan back there. Do you guys want to add anything at all? No? Okay. I just figured I'd ask. Okay.
Sure.
I couldn't resist.
Couldn't resist.
I could not resist.
Appreciate you asking. Bob Marola, 22 Ashford Lane. I'm on the council. And I'll just give you some of my opinions. One of the things Mary Ann alluded to, which I think is
important, but not the highest priority that you would be looking at. One of the concerns that I have is the lack of voter participation in town. So even if we have 30% vote and it's a 60-40 vote, which we probably don't get, that's 18% of the people, registered folks, are driving what's going on. So whether we bifurcate or advisory questions or whatever, if during your research, if you could determine what impact bifurcation has on voter participation, that would be something I'd be interested in. The other thing, and this is just kind of background information, I think part of the problem we had this year and in the last couple of years has been, I'll call it the unlevel playing field that we begin with. On the municipal side, we come in relatively lean, and the last 3 years the Board of Ed is coming in at 108 initially, 108 and 106 for a request. So when you saw those requests start to be reduced, and an example, the 700,000 that was found by the Board of Finance, I like to call better numbers. It's a reduction, but it's just better numbers. And the example I like to use is, if I need to put a new roof on my house and I budget $12,000, and I ask John to come out and give me an estimate, and you say it's $9,000, it's $9,000. It's not $12,000. It's not really a reduction. It's just a better number. And we have a lot of that goes on because of all of these moving parts. And a couple of years ago, the reduction was $2.5 million. Really, 1.4 of that was better numbers. So I've been trying to get people to talk in terms like this so that we could better understand. And the debt service I like to see separated, and separated between the two, so that we have better clarity, if you will, and transparency in what we're really looking at. So the operational budgets now that we're looking at, because I've been keeping charts for like 10 years, and I have all the numbers, and the problem that we see, that I see causing some of the divisiveness, is when one starts here and one starts here. So if both budgets started at a more reasonable amount, I don't think we'd have as many referenda as we do now. But that's just my opinion. So in terms of bifurcation or advisory questions, I think you have a tough job. I did a little research on this before the last one, and it wasn't clear to me what the right answer would be. So I'm glad you folks are taking another look at it. I just wish that we had much more voter participation so that we could have a better handle, whether it's advisory or not. But I'll be happy to take some questions, but I wanted to give you some of my insight. And by the way, just for the record, I was one of the ones who said I would not put money back into the education budget. Michelle alluded to that before, not that it was me, but I'll say that. And the reason was, when I first got elected, I've been elected, I was elected in November, and I sat on the council for about a year before that, sitting in for someone else. And people would say, oh, Bob, you've been elected now, don't raise my taxes. That's one kind of a statement. But this year, there were a lot of people who came up and said zero budget, which is a whole different kind of comment. And so while we got a lot of emails of folks saying no, too low, we got a lot of emails saying zero budget. So you had this, both sides of this pendulum, swing, if you will, that you had to deal with. And I thought we made a few compromises along the way trying to get the budget passed, and that's what happened. So that's kind of some background information. So if you have any questions for me about this, I'd be happy to take them. But I did want to set some background information level from me.
Any questions for Bob? Go ahead, Michelle.
So in future budgets, was this just a one-time, one-year event that you would be opposed to putting money back into a budget, whether it's education or town? If you had advisory questions, would...
That certainly would help, yeah. It would give us more information than we had now, right? I mean, we didn't have that kind of information, so that would certainly help. And I don't know if you brought it up, but someone else. So if there was an advisory question and it was said no, too high, too low, and let's say 500 votes or 2,000 votes were no, and you had 1,010 versus 990, you go like that. If you have 1,500 and 500, kind of like the first vote of the 600 down, which was a major defeat in terms of everybody, I think, agreed with that. So, you know, that would you'd kind of be, and I think it was alluded to today, you'd have a little bit of a dilemma of how much. One of the thoughts I had while I was back there, and when somebody said how much kind of thing, one of the things I like to think about, and we don't always implement this, is the mill rate. So let's assume a tenth of a mill is $400,000. If you don't increase or decrease by at least $400,000, as an example, it really probably doesn't affect the tax. So one way to consider it is think in terms of 400 chunks of 400, as an example, plus and minus or whatever. So that's maybe some kind of a consideration. That could be a guidance or whatever. So, yeah.
Any other questions for Bob? Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for being on this commission. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.
I think it's August 20th, right? Okay. So, before we go into voter comments and discussion, I'm sorry. You want to go? Come on up. I did give you a chance before. You turned me down. You couldn't resist.
To say was one of the biggest issues that I felt as a first-time person on the council was the lack of information and feedback that we got from the public and in general. I mean, we knew where some of it was coming from we got a lot from the education side, but there wasn't a lot. And you know, I think on the second referendum, I think the most we got was about somewhere between 80 and 100 emails. Relatively speaking, that's very few. So I'm really for the advisory questions because I think we need the feedback. We need to know what everybody is out there thinking. As a first-time person on the board, this is my first budget. I was really at a loss for which way to go after the second one. So it really, to have these questions will help us a lot. I understand the desire to put some teeth in the questions, but if you do that, I think you're really going to have to put a lot more questions on there. Are you too high, too low, or too high, too low by 100,000, 200,000, 300,000, and so on, to really know which way to go. I mean, do you lower it by, or increase it by 100, 200, 300, or a million? So to put teeth on it without adding a lot more questions to it, you know, it's kind of hard to do that. So you got to really think about whether or not you want to put teeth on it, or how much, to what degree you put it on there. That's really all I had. I just wanted to add that so that everybody knew. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, so that gets all public officials that we had invited or chose to speak this evening. Before we go to voter comments and discussion, what did you guys learn tonight? Go right ahead, Bob.
Well, I learned that the suggestion of trying to follow up to see the experience in other towns with bifurcated budgets, whether they can point to real answers on the question of divisiveness, is a very good suggestion, and I think we should at least make some attempt in the next, well, we're not going to have a meeting, what, for another couple of weeks, right?
Yeah, our next, well, it hasn't put out to the public, but our next scheduled meeting will be August 7th.
Yeah, so we're looking at
just shy of 2 weeks.
2 weeks, yeah, almost 2 weeks. It seems to me that in that 2-week time period, we might be able to find a few answers on that, because that's the one area, I thought, that might be very helpful in our deliberations, because otherwise we're acting on our own assumptions.
Totally agree. Totally agree. Comments from anyone else? Tony?
What I learned is that basically the budget's already bifurcated. And the issue is whether we vote on it that way or not. They said it's a hard line. So going forward, when they're talking about this new study about cooperation, they're going to have to come up with the accounting anyway, one way or the other, because the budgets are, for all intents and purposes, separate. So I don't think that should be a factor one way or the other. They're going to have to deal with the issue. The finance is going to have to be dealt with. The debt service is going to have to be dealt with one way or the other. So that's what I picked up from this.
Yeah. Nick? We're getting used to it.
Yeah. Learned a bunch of things, but I guess 3 things stick out in my head. First one, the argument that was sort of the historic argument that, gee, we really can't do this because it's going to be divisive. I think that has pretty much been put to the side. Even Pat Loder, who I know was strongly opposed to bifurcation in the past because she felt it would be divisive. Even Pat says this last experience that we've had really says we've got to do something. Second point was, I think, interesting discussion on the debt service. And not specifically in our charter, but I think it also says other things as appropriate. That's probably something we should look at, particularly if we're going to try to break out pieces of the budget for advisory questions or analysis. We need to make that differentiation on the debt service. And the last thing was an idea which I had not thought of, I think, Bob, it was yours, where you have the advisory question states, if this budget fails, would you like to see, as opposed to simply yes, no too high, no too low. That may solve a number of the issues and still give us the information that we need. So,
Jim?
I guess I'm coming away from the conversation thinking that nobody really has a concrete answer as to what the best direction to go in is, and I'm hearing folks come down on a number of sides of the issue. I also am hearing that there is an expectation that we do a lot of research before we come up with our final answer, and we really don't have a whole lot of time to do some of this in-depth research that I personally would love to see done on the issue, and maybe that's something that take place in the next go-round. But I haven't come to a definitive decision as to what my position will be on this in the next couple of weeks. I think there's a lot of confusion out there, and I see pluses and minuses on a variety of the issues.
Michelle?
I came into this wondering if we're looking at the right thing to fix the issues. And I wanted to be very careful that we're not doing a knee-jerk reaction to 4 failed referenda. But I think, just in listening to everybody who's talked, I think that is what everybody wants. And I think it's our job to make sure that we aren't just doing a gut reaction, let's revise the charter. Maybe it's because a small faction of people are not happy with the people that we've elected to office. But I think, as Pat Loder has said, we've had many years of repeated referenda, and maybe this is the answer. I don't know.
Alan, Craig, you want to add something?
I would, thank you. Well, I think what really stands out to me in terms of the charge of our commission in looking at bifurcation or advisory questions, what came out to me from everyone speaking and the questions asked by the people on the panel of our speakers is that it opens up a lot of other questions, and that those other questions cannot be adequately addressed by this commission in a month. It's just not going to happen. So we're either going to make a lot of assumptions or really try and pull this back together into a more narrow view. We'll have our discussions, but we're going to have to start to chisel it very quickly in our discussions amongst ourselves. Otherwise, we're just going to end up going around in circles, because there's just a lot that came out here tonight.
Alan?
I signed up for the commission because I envisioned my role as being of help to you folks on the Legislative Council, and just one night of listening to just a handful of people, I'm really concerned that I have to be extra careful not to make things even worse. And going forward, I'm going to be a lot more mindful of that possibility. I mean, there's no perfect solution. This is just going to be trade-off, no matter which way you slice it. But speaking for myself, I think I'm going to be a lot more mindful of that. Just do no harm first and foremost.
I will. I had to keep from laughing real hard because I was in this chair 2 years ago, and what John Court said was literally identical to what he said to our commission. The difference this time, which is kind of interesting, is you can see a shift away from not too much risk to maybe it's time for a little bit more risk. You heard what Pat said. I think everyone just got really tired over the last season. That's why I signed up again, because I was totally befuddled by what just happened. And given that what we had proposed earlier did technically pass but didn't have enough votes to be affirmed in the charter, I knew that people were ready for something. But I think what you'll find is I'm as confused today as I was 2 years ago, because the debt service thing threw me for a loop. I never even thought of having to consider that as part of the conversation. I think at the end of the day, we owe it to ourselves. We got about 11 days, 12 days. Now, obviously, I'll be out of town next week, so it's easy for me to say that. But what I think we should do for our own sanity and to at least have some guideposts is try to do some kind of 3 or 4 case studies of towns that have bifurcated budgets that are similar to Newtown, in some cases, socioeconomic, whatever, school district type or characteristics of our school district, as it is 2/3 of our budget, and look at towns that have advisory questions. Because ultimately what you're finding is, you said it, Alan, you said it right, we don't want to screw things up even more. That's not what we want to do here. But if you listen, I think the distinct difference, if you look at people who have been on the councils or boards longer than those who are newer, right, people do want a better, they want to discern voter intent. The question would be, how do we do it? And I'm a research guy by training. You can't make the voter confused at the ballot box, because anyone who's taken a research study will be confused if you give them too many options. And I hate undervotes. So if someone says no, 2,000 votes say no, and you only get 1,000 people answering why, what does that really tell you? So that's something you got to worry about as well. And these are the questions that we talked about 2 years ago. So with that in mind, one concept that some of us have been bouncing around is we are what's called a DRG-B school district. So Newtown is a DRG-B. I think it's A to H. There are 3 districts in the state: Simsbury, Madison, and Fairfield. Not all of them are perfect matches to us, but they have bifurcated budgets, and they are similar type socioeconomic status as us. What I think at a minimum we do over the next 2 weeks is at least compare Newtown to these 3 towns, and then somehow contact the first selectman or members of those boards and commissions how bifurcation has worked for them. At least that's a start. The other piece is we have to find, because I know getting advisory question research is I think it's what, a 1-month turnaround from CCM, but they can get us local towns. We might not be able to do DRG comparison, but at least get towns in this area that use advisory questions and see what their experience has been with that.
John, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Nick.
I'm not trying to get out of doing homework.
No.
But we have a pretty detailed look at that very data from 2010, and from Michelle's efforts, we've got a pretty detailed look at that same data from 2011, so we're not really starting from scratch.
No, we're not. No, we're not. And all I'm saying is add what we already have and try to do at least 3 towns as a comparison, so at least we can see what they're doing.
John, I think it's a fallacy to say that we should be looking at the DRGBs to answer this question, because this really is a question of process. A DRGD or a DRGA is going to have the same process question whether they're higher socioeconomic or lower socioeconomic. For instance, New Milford, which I think is a D, does have a bifurcated budget, and I have a good friend up there, and I'm starting to communicate with him and talk about it, and I'm going to get the charter and so forth looking at New Milford, but they're a D, and I don't think we should limit ourselves to a B. I think any town that has our type of government, where you have a referendum on the budget as a routine matter, we should look at that. And I'm going to look at New Milford. So I don't think we should limit ourselves to DRGBs.
I don't disagree, Bob. What I'm trying to do is keep the focus as quick as we can, so at least by the 7th, we have some starting point. That was my only proposal. Milford would make sense, because we did look at Milford the last time. New Milford, I'm sorry, New Milford. We did look at New Milford the last time. Any other comments regarding that? Yes, ma'am.
I think the town...
Could you identify yourself and address, please?
I think the town has Elizabeth Lincoln, Echo Valley Road, Newtown.
Thank you.
And
welcome.
I haven't had any children go through the school system here, but I have lived in other towns where they have. And the situation that I found our family in at this point in time was that the school board budget was so out of line with common sense and fairness. And I think you folks are being asked to correct the situation as wisely as you can for years. But I think what happened was the previous school board lost our trust. And as far as I'm concerned, the present school superintendent. When they come out at the beginning of the year and they ask for a budget of a 5-point-something increase, right away your antenna go up and you say, I've already had enough of these school board budgets when they get 80 to 85% out of every tax dollar. And the town, under Pat Loder's skilled leadership, has managed to run this town on far less money for far more people with far greater projects than the school board has. Now we have a new school board, and I think these people have gotten the message. And the message is we're all tired of the largesse for the children.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. I thought we were limiting ourselves to invited guests and public officials. Now, I enjoy listening to Ms. Lincoln, but I think she should have spoken at public participation, unless we're into another phase of that.
We're not. We do have a section of voter comments. She raised her hand. We let her speak.
So we're in voter comments now.
We haven't.
I apologize if I offended Mr. Hall.
No, you didn't offend me. I just want this.
Wait, you know what? You know what is? My apologies. We're a little out of order, but we'll let her finish. We'll go back into our discussions.
But I think, you know, what I'm feeling for you people, I used to attend all the meetings that Bill Shellick ran. They called me the 13th member for that revision committee, and I know how hard they worked. And I think your work at this point in time is far greater than what they faced then. They initiated the Board of Finance. And I think John Quartz and Mr. Waterbury and the Finance Board have done a wonderful job for this town, both for the Board of Education and for the town budget. They've scrutinized everything. They're very bright men, and they're very dedicated. And I think the town needs to respect more their judgment. And I think the people who have a disagreement with the budget, in other words, the budget isn't high enough, they should feed that information to the people that represent them in their districts. So when those people then go to the Legislative Council, they're saying, we're having a number of people come in and say the school budget isn't high enough for this reason or that reason. You have a filtering system. We have a Legislative Council. We have a Board of Education, all filled with really good people. I don't know what the political atmosphere is in town because I'm not in it. But I get the impression that there's a lot of good people.
There are.
And I think we should trust all of you.
Totally agree with you.
And the elected officials to make the decisions. And the people that are disgruntled because the school budget isn't high enough, they should feed that information to the council, to the finance board, and their district representatives. And that way, Pat Lodred and the Board of Ed people would be able to make better decisions. So I think what you set up today may be a knee-jerk reaction for the economic times. People were just, we're listening to Wisconsin, and then we're listening to our federal government, who sees no end to the largesse that we're all responsible for. So I think the times have dictated a different response. And I think if you try to do something really quickly to get it on the ballot for November, you may be forced into doing something that long-term isn't good. You have a better Board of Education now that seems to have a feeling of a tighter rein on their budget. Pat Lodra certainly has a very good rein on her budget.
Thank you.
And I think you could make it work.
Thank you very much. Okay. Bob, back to our discussion regarding New Milford.
Yes, I mean, I'm interested to see not only exactly how they do it, but whether there's any pushback from either side of their government to having it bifurcated. I don't know when they made it separate. I don't know how far back it goes.
My understanding, it has been a few years. I don't know how many years. And I think it's worked fairly well.
I thought it worked well, too. That's why I was curious. That's why I wanted to do some research on this question of divisiveness, because I don't believe that a bifurcated budget is automatically divisive. I think that if it is if it's something that allows the voter to vote, you can vote two different ways, you know. You're not stuck with having to decide, well, am I happy with one budget and unhappy with the other, and is my unhappiness greater than my happiness, so I'm going to vote no on the whole package. You know, you can vote both sides and let the chips fall where they may. You don't have to be angry about it.
The observation I made this time around versus 2 years ago is we all worried about divisiveness from the public and from the board. And I think the difference this time is we are now already have met divisiveness, right? So we're beyond that.
We met divisiveness.
We've met divisiveness
it is
right
us.
in the face, and we have lost, right? So, Jim, go ahead.
That may be true, but we still do not want to do things that would cause that divisiveness to continue unnecessarily into the future.
Right.
And it is clear in my mind that we could do things that would create a sense of divisiveness in the community. And my hope is that we're cognizant of that fact and don't do anything. As Ellen says, do no harm.
Do no harm. Greg?
Well, I think you mentioned the concern of divisiveness being, a primary concern. But what we heard today was a whole lot of more mechanical concerns. Divisiveness is more of an emotional, what we heard today, from Board of Finance and and again from our speakers, is that mechanically it's difficult. It doesn't mean it can't be done, but how fast do you do it? How do you plan for it? You know, and I think change management for something like that is a lot bigger than 2 questions on a ballot.
My only comment is we moved here from New Jersey where they have independent school districts, and it was always, and you always voted for an education budget, you always voted for a town budget, and there was never any, it was either this budget's too high or too low, this budget's too high or too low. There was never any, well, we're going to take $200,000 from this budget and put it on this budget, put it there. It was, they were voted independently, and then you set your mill rate. So I just never, when people talk about divisiveness, I don't know what you know, the budget's too high or it's too low. One or the other. It's this strange system here where it's, well, we think that's too high. Okay, we're going to take some money from Peter and pay it to Paul. It should either be if it's too high, it's too high. If it's too low, it's too low. I mean, you know, people vote. That's why you have a vote. I just don't see it as a divisive issue. It is what it is. I mean, most of the country works that way.
Any other comments? Michelle?
I think that's true, but going back to what Pat Lodra said, we are a town, and the schools and the municipal services are all part of that whole feeling that we have as a town. And it would be nice if we could support all of those things together. I understand that there are places that separate them out, but I do like Pat Lodra's sentiment that it would be nice if we were a united town, standing behind everything that we do as a town.
Any other comments? I guess from a research standpoint, Bob, you don't have any problems taking on New Milford?
No, not at all. Not at all. In fact, if I can find another town, I'll take them both on.
Would you be interested in doing Simsbury?
My impression, John, is that the Charter Revision Commission a couple of years ago did these towns, and
we did New Milford, and I believe we did Watertown.
Oh, these other 2 were not done?
No, we didn't do Simsbury.
Okay, I'd be happy to do Simsbury.
If you could do Simsbury, it would be great. The reason why I think Simsbury is interesting is it's similar in size.
Similar, yeah.
It's very similar in size. I think the other 2 towns were Madison. Fairfield is a little different than us. I mean, it's a pretty big town. Yeah, I don't think that's I mean, yeah, I think that, huh? GE. Oh yeah, Fairfield, that's right. Yeah, my company's headquarters. Madison is similar to us except smaller. Do you want to try?
I know some people in Madison.
Do you want to try Madison?
I'd be happy to
they're the same DRG as we are. They're 18,000 people.
About that, and they've got shared governance in a variety of ways. So I'll bring you back some information from there.
That'd be great. Michelle, in what you found from CCM, when did they say they get back to us as far as towns that have advisory questions in our area? From now? From yesterday. Okay, so sometime next week. I think based on our last discussion, the last meeting, we're good for August 7th, and I know George Coleman can make it. Is there anyone that is going to miss that date? You going to miss it, Tony? All right. We'll have a quorum, though. You okay with that? All right. The question I have is, do you want to tentatively, if possible, can we think about 2 meetings, potentially the week after, the 14th and the 16th? If you guys could check your calendars. I know from my perspective it looks good, and these are only tentative. Just at least block them in the calendars, because obviously we're going to put out public notice. Because I think what's going to happen is we're going to have a lot of discussions on August 7th. All right? And the whole idea of, and what I want you guys to do is think about what you heard tonight and just reflect upon what you heard from everyone. I know my brain's going, I'm trying to compare what I heard last time versus now. Things are different. Things are different. August 7th is the one I'll put out an agenda for. Tentatively, for the public, it's not going to go out in agenda format yet, but 14th and 16th, which would be Tuesday and Thursday. The reason being, just so we know, we have to get the report done by the 20th. In the event we have to call the town attorney, Dave Grogan, we need some lead time for that. All right? And that way we have at least a week's of solid research based on a discussion on the 7th. All right? If something's wrong with people's calendars, let me know as soon as we can, because possibly we could do something the 9th. I just need notice for that to get out the agendas if we have to shift the day from the 14th to, say, the 9th. You're not here the 14th. Okay, so you're here the 16th. Okay, I would imagine we'll see how we do on the 7th. Because what I would want to do is probably have the public hearing on the 16th. Correct. Actually, that's a good point. I don't know if I can do the 9th. I'll have to check with George. All right. Let's stick with the 7th, 14th, 16th. Worst case scenario, we'll have a 20th meeting, which is the last day. That's fine. We're going to have all meetings at 7:30, except if there's a public hearing, it'll be at 7. So that's fine. As long as we're at 7:30 and have a quorum, we'll get started. Any other questions from anyone? Now, I'm going to ask members of the public, are any additional last vote or comments that anyone would like to add? That's the plan. Unless we get thrown out by Inland Wetlands Commission. They've been nice enough to give us this. I have no announcements, so do I have a motion to adjourn?
Second.
Okay, I think we're all in favor. All in favor.